Hi, my name is Michael, and you're about to learn why the stories you love are garbage. And today we're talking about The Magic Goes Away by Larry Niven. This is probably the least controversial take of mine. Even fans of that novel usually agree that the story is pretty weak. They love it for its ideas instead. I never cared much about ideas unless they are abhorrent. What makes a story for me is the plot and characters, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Also, there is a short story called Not Long Before the End, which is kind of a prologue to the novel, so let's start with that. The short story involves a swordsman battling a sorcerer. This is pretty much stated in the beginning, with a nice quip about swordsmen usually losing in such an encounter and the average IQ of the human race rising as a result. It's a nice joke, reminding me of a modern version about a Ukrainian moving to Russia, which increases the average IQ of both countries. Very much appreciated. Anyway, this particular swordsman has a powerful artifact with him, making him absolutely invulnerable. The short story kinda works on its own, although I think foreshadowing for the eventual solution could be longer and explanation after it shorter. But it works much better as a prologue to the novel itself. It feels like a prologue, despite being published almost a decade prior. For those who haven't read it, the story introduces the concept of mana, a source of all magic, which eventually gets used up as the wizards cast spells, and eventually no more magic can be done in this particular area, forcing a wizard to relocate. The warlock's idea was to basically use it up quickly, depriving both himself and his opponent of all magic, not just spells, but also artifacts, thus making his opponent vulnerable again. There were a few more short stories set in the same universe, but then we come to the novel, which tries to expand on the same idea and, in my opinion, fails miserably. So, the book begins with the warlock and his buddies gathering in a small town in order to discuss ways to bring magic back. 5 people show up, one of them a woman. They have their conference, which is not really a conference. Only 2 people contribute anything. The warlock, who suggests bringing the moon down and draining it of mana, and another wizard who is currently a talking skull. He suggests a way to actually do it. Problem is, that skull was always in the warlock's possession. 5 people attend a conference, and a solution is provided by 2 of them who were together before. There was no need for a conference at all. No reason they couldn't just have a friendly chat at home. One other guy was completely useless, another walked away to become the story's villain, except that the main conflict of the book was already established. It was man versus nature, and as such it did not need a human antagonist. And a woman was only useful in giving Boris Vallejo something to work with when he was drawing the cover art. Thank God modern books don't usually include characters that only exist to make everybody around very horny. Go away! Of course, draining the moon can only be a stopgap measure, which none of the characters acknowledge. If the Earth mana was used up in a relatively short period of time, why would they think the moon's one wouldn't be used up even faster? I would accept it as a way to give themselves some more time, but it needed to be said explicitly, and it wasn't. They discussed it as if the moon's magic would last literally forever, which is pretty stupid. There is one more person at this conference. You know how many stories introduce a Watson character who is just as clueless as the audience about what's going on and provides an opportunity for the main characters to explain things to them and to the readers as well. This book has one. He's there, and he also doesn't provide any useful input. After the conference is done, the wizards drag him along for reason. I guess they just liked him. I do not. That character is a swordsman, and the novel clearly forgot the joke from the short story, which is very applicable here, as that swordsman is dumb as a rock. Watson-like character works well if the audience identifies with them. A Conan-style barbarian is not just hard to identify with. I don't know about you, but personally, I don't want to identify with him. The book would be much better if it just threw him away and explained everything in the author's narration, which is also an option. Then there is a bunch of nothing, but finally we get to the climax of the story. The heroes successfully kill the dragon, wake up a god, and ask him to please get the moon down. And then the god draws them a picture of what would happen. A catastrophe that would likely kill all humans. And they go, no, we didn't know, and such, which is... No! I mean, they did know the moon was huge. Otherwise, why would they even think about replenishing Earth magic with it? Did they really think they could just put it somewhere to be eaten later and there would be no trouble with it? The god is still going along with the idea, so they kill it. Again, with the same trick, just draining the magic from the area. And that's it. They failed, which is a good thing. As I always say, failure is what makes everything interesting. But the solution was an exact replica of the one from the short story. And even if you haven't read the short story, it's kinda obvious. But the biggest issue with the novel is something else. See, the whole plot doesn't need to exist in the first place. See, the novel doesn't really deliver on the promise made at the end of the short story, when the warlock laments that eventually all mana would be gone and it would be the end of the civilization. In the novel, the mana is very nearly gone, and we see the civilization is still standing. It's not a problem in the short story, since we don't get to see anything beyond the small area around the warlock's house. In the novel, however, we see, for example, the town of Priesthill, whatever, which used to be a trading center for magical artifacts. Now, magic doesn't work there, magical artifacts are nowhere to be found, and yet the town doesn't just survive, it's growing. And it's not a deliberate choice, like a ray of hope it could be. Magic seeping out of the world is still considered the end of it. The narrative is in direct conflict with the world building, to the point that finding a way to restore magic is considered the world's salvation, and it doesn't need one. It gets worse though. The book tries to showcase the magic leaving the world being bad, and the best way it can do so is by mentioning that the main characters had to walk for days to get to their conference, instead of just flying for a few hours. Here's the thing. We do encounter a few muggles, and they don't mention flying at all. I don't mean flying on their own, of course, but rather buying a ticket to a flying carpet or something like that. Flying is not a mode of transportation people used to have access to. It was a privilege enjoyed by a few select individuals. So instead of the end of the civilization, we get A bunch of guys who lose their privileges. Are we supposed to weep at the fate of a few billionaires after a big company goes bankrupt? Regular people, on the other hand, seem to be doing fine. I already mentioned the growing town. The book makes one more attempt to justify its message by having a stone golem, which was supposed to guard the town, be almost dead. We are probably supposed to envision the town being nearly defenseless and soon pillaged by enemies, but the enemies would have the same problem. Defense magic doesn't work, but neither does attack magic. And honestly, I don't see how is this necessarily a bad thing. Battles with swords and shields can be devastating, but I'm yet to be convinced magical battles would be less so. In fact, we were given the extreme example of magical shenanigans potentially wiping out all of humanity. The book could have leaned into this. It could present the main characters as misguided, their eventual failure being probably bad for them, but potentially good in general, with a message magic goes away and that's fine. But it doesn't. It can't recognize its own issues and it expects the reader to just nod along. And that's really sad. That's all I have to say. We'll see you next time. Bye.